Okay, this is a review of the worksheet that we did that was comparing photosynthesis to cell respiration. So this is a very simple overview, I guess, comparing the two processes. So the first thing that I have here is sort of showing the flow of energy. Remember, matter can be recycled. Energy cannot be recycled. Energy, remember, everything tends to flow towards disorder. Energy can't be created or destroyed. So if we look at this diagram, you're going to see the energy coming in as sunlight. What happens to the energy? Well, the energy is, some of it is captured by ATP, some of it's being held in the coenzymes. It goes to the Calvin cycle, and now the energy's been incorporated into glucose. When the cell needs the energy, the cell will now take that glucose, this would be glycolysis here, to pyruvate to the Krebs cycle. Some ATP are made here, some of the energy is being carried over, and here's our electron transport chain. And notice the final form of all energy is heat. In fact, only 1% of the sun's energy is actually captured by photosynthesis. Not only that, but remember that only 40% of the energy is actually captured by ATP in the process of cell respiration. So at every step in the cycle, some of this energy is leaving as heat. And that's it. When the energy passes through the cycle, it's done. So we can recycle the products, yes. Photosynthesis, if you notice, produces oxygen during the first step, during the light reactions. And that oxygen is also used for cell respiration as the electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Photosynthesis requires water, and water is a product of the electron transport chain. Also, Krebs cycle makes carbon dioxide. That is our waste product from cell respiration from the breakdown of sugar. Calvin cycle takes the carbon dioxide, hooks the hydrogens back up with it, and so we're going basically from carbon dioxide back to C6H12O6. So we do have glucose and carbon dioxide and oxygen and water, CH and O. These three things, yes, are being recycled back and forth, not the energy. The other thing I want to remind you about, what organisms do photosynthesis or some kind of a process similar to it? Autotrophic organisms. Usually we think of plants, but also some algae, or actually all algae do some form of that. Certain bacteria, blue-green bacteria. What organisms do cell respiration? All organisms need energy. Therefore, all organisms use some form of cell respiration. Now we do have some bacteria that only do anaerobic respiration. We know about that. Anaerobic, they make ethanol and carbon dioxide. But all eukaryotic organisms, including plants, are doing cell respiration with mitochondria. It's a huge misconception that plants do photosynthesis and animals do cell respiration. Plants do both. The only difference is, in order for us to do cell respiration, we have to eat our glucose. We have to get our glucose from another source. Plants are making their own glucose. And if you go back to ecology and relate this to the food, the energy pyramid thing, you'll remember that we have our gross primary productivity, and this is all the photosynthesis that the plants do. But then we have to subtract from that what they need themselves for cell respiration. And that's how we got our net primary productivity. And all of that explains that little 10% rule. Why is only 10% of the energy available for the next level, for the herbivores? Because they're using a lot of what they make themselves just to stay alive. What's passed on is just what's left over. So they're using some of that sugar themselves. In fact, they're using some of the oxygen they make themselves as well. So hopefully that gives you a little start on that. Mitochondria and chloroplasts, very similar in some ways. They both have a double membrane. Remember the endosymbiotic theory. We think they both came about from some kind of prokaryotic or an organism engulfing another organism. A couple things that they do that are very similar. First of all, matrix. Think of the matrix in the mitochondria as sort of like the liquid portion. Well, in the liquid portion of the mitochondria, we have a cycle that happens. The Krebs cycle. The job of the Krebs cycle, well, it basically finishes the breakdown of glucose. By the end of the Krebs cycle, Basically, all the glucose has been broken down to CO2. The hydrogens have been transferred to NADH and FADH2, and they're going to go to the electron transport chain, but the carbon dioxide is done. Well, the photosynthesis, the chloroplast also has a liquid portion, which is the stroma. In the stroma, a cycle happens. The cycle is called the Calvin cycle. In the Calvin cycle, the carbon dioxide hooks up with hydrogens from NADPH, and we end up making sugar. So notice that these two cycles are in some ways like opposites of each other. One of them finishes the breakdown of sugar, and the other one puts sugar together. The other thing that's important is the membrane, the inner membrane here of the mitochondria, sometimes called the cristae. That's where the electron transport chain happens. Well, guess what? These little thingamajiggers here, these are thylakoids, and in the membranes of the thylakoids, an electron transport chain happens. So across membranes, we see electron transport chains. In the liquid portion, we see these two cycles. So in some ways, they're very, very similar. If you understand one, you can understand the other. Okay, this is a little diagram I showed you guys explaining that basically light has energy. Different wavelengths contain different amounts of energy, and this is our visual spectrum. This is what we can see. And it turns out that not all light is absorbed evenly. Plants, the pigments that plants have, mainly chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, carotenoids are kind of like called accessory pigments. One of the main things they do is they protect the plant from UV light. But anyway, bottom line, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, they're not just pigments that give the plants color, they're pigments that have the ability to absorb light energy and basically stimulate an electron transport chain to capture the energy in ATP. They have the ability to have excited electrons that can then lead to capturing energy in ATP. Well, it turns out that those electrons are only excited by particular frequencies of light. Over here at this end of the range, and then over here at this end of the range. And so what we see is that plants are green. Why are plants green? Because that's the color that's not being absorbed. That's the color that plants are unable to capture any energy from to excite their electrons. It's being reflected back. And so that's something that I wanted to show you. And if by some chance they gave you something weird on the AP exam, like they told you that they were talking about a red algae or something, a red algae would not have a line spectrum like this. A red algae would probably have some kind of a line spectrum that looked like this. It would be red because that's the color that was being reflected, and it would have maybe xanthophyll or cyanin or some other pigment that could absorb energy at a different frequency. Okay, and then this was a chart that we filled out about where different things go in the cycle. So what I'm going to do is actually write the formula here. So we have C6H12O6 plus O2, and we make CO2 and H2O. And in photosynthesis, we have what appears to be kind of the opposite of that. Carbon dioxide and water make C6H12O6 and O2. All right. So let's talk about this. So what's happening in cell respiration, the carbon and the oxygen here form our CO2. That's where they go. Sugar gets broken down and we end up with CO2. The hydrogen gets captured temporarily by NADH and FADH2, and then that hydrogen ultimately ends up hooking up with oxygen as the final electron acceptor and is basically water. So if they asked a question where they said, hey, we radioactively tagged oxygen from the air, where would it most likely end up at the end of cell respiration? Where would we find that oxygen? We'd find it here, in the water, not in the CO2. And remember also that this last step doesn't happen until the electron transport chain. All the other stuff, the breakdown of the sugar into CO2, releasing the CO2, and capturing the hydrogens by NADH and FADH2, that all happens prior, and then in the electron transport chain, we have our last step. So now let's look at photosynthesis. The light reactions of photosynthesis only require light and water and the pigments. The light reactions of photosynthesis basically take water. Because of the electron transport chain, what ends up happening is electrons leave and they need to be replaced. Bottom line, when the electrons get replaced, it splits water. Oxygen is released during the light reactions. Notice no carbon dioxide has come into play yet. The hydrogens, well, these exact hydrogens are replacing hydrogens that left, but the bottom line is what ultimately happens to hydrogen is hydrogen ends up being incorporated into sugar. So if we were to radioactively tag, for example, the oxygen in CO2, it's not that carbon dioxide then becomes oxygen. That's not what happens. The carbon dioxide, just like the opposite of what happened in cell respiration. The carbon dioxide is going to have the hydrogen incorporated with it, and it's going to become the sugar. And that happens in the dark reactions. So the hydrogen and water, or the oxygen and water here, happen in an electron transport chain portion. And then the other part happens in a cycle, which is our Calvin cycle. And here, this mainly happened in a cycle, although you did have the oxidation of pyruvates and that, but generally the Krebs cycle. All right, so that's important. All right, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. Some of this stuff is really simple. Krebs cycle is in the matrix of the mitochondria. If you recall, per glucose, it turned twice because we made 2 pyruvates and then each pyruvate got processed. Electron transport chain happened in the cristae. The light reaction, which is basically an electron transport chain, happens in the membranes, which in this case are called thylakoids. What does it need? Well, if we look above, it needs water and it needs sunlight. And I guess it needs NADP to pick up hydrogens. What does it make? It makes ATP and NADPH and oxygen, but the oxygen is released as a waste product. The dark reactions, the Calvin cycle, happen in the stroma. What does it need? It needs what the light reactions made, the temporary storage of energy in ATP from the sunlight, and the NADPH, which is going to give us the hydrogens. If you think of the formula for sugar, C6, 6 carbons, it basically would take 6 turns to make a sugar because it's picking up CO2s one at a time. So 6 turns is going to give us sugar. Okay. This has a lot of stuff. ATP is actually made by ATP synthase. How do we get the electrochemical gradient? Well, and I don't want to spend too much time, but if this was our mitochondria, remember that the NAD and the FADH2, basically, they lose their hydrogens here, and they build up. And that causes an electrochemical gradient. The electrons travel down an electron transport chain, and then ATP synthase lets these hydrogens come back through and generates ATP. And what do the hydrogens hook up with? They hook up with oxygen to make water. I know that was quick, but it's just a review, guys. Anaerobic, remember, in bacteria. In us, we get lactic acid. We can't survive on anaerobic because it's, for one thing, lactic acid's toxic and it doesn't make enough ATP. For this, I was just going for that this form would be the oxidized and this would be the reduced. This is the part I wanted to get to before I run out of time. How do organisms get the oxygen? If it's a simple organism, a protist, a simple worm, even an earthworm, it can get what it needs by diffusion. Oxygen's going to go in, carbon dioxide's going to go out. Why doesn't it reach equilibrium? Because the oxygen is being consumed in the reaction, and carbon dioxide's being produced, so you're not going to reach equilibrium. Everything is basically going to constantly flow from higher to lower, and you're always going to have higher oxygen outside than inside, and you're always going to have higher CO2 inside than outside. What do fish do? Fish have gills. What are their gills really? They're kind of like feather-like things with a bunch of capillaries, and as the water flows over them, the oxygen goes in and the carbon dioxide goes out. So basically, guess what? It's diffusion, but it's diffusion across gills. Land animals typically have lungs. Now here's the thing, it's not just that the air goes into these big giant sacs that are lungs and that's it. What has to happen is the oxygen has to get dissolved. All organisms have to dissolve the oxygen. That's why these that do it by diffusion, like earthworms for example, have to have a moist skin. If their skin dries out, they basically suffocate. So we have to dissolve the oxygen. Bottom line, we have little air sacs and capillaries, and the oxygen dissolves across this liquid called surfactant, and that's how we basically get our oxygen. It's by, again, diffusion. Ultimately, the oxygen's always going in by diffusion. It's just at what point it diffuses. And then plants have stomata. And I'm going to run out of time here. So in the next one, I'm going to talk about just photosynthesis and stomata and the C3